So let's go ahead and for each of our panelists, and Vivian will probably be here by the time you guys get to her, go ahead and introduce yourself with your name, your current position, what you're doing now, and then also what university you attended as an undergraduate. Let's go ahead and Sean, you're on the close side. Actually, let's start with Andrew because then we'll work our way all the way to Vivian.
So hi, I'm Andrew. I am currently a graduate student at Stanford, and let's see, wait, what else?
Where did you go as for undergraduate?
Okay, so I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and is that it? Okay.
My name is Stephanie. I'm currently a graduate student at the School of Medicine. I work in cancer biology, and for undergraduate, I went to Bridgewater State College in Massachusetts.
Could you add or try to graduate?
So I was actually homeschooled.
Yeah, I'm not going to be much help. I went to high school in Canada.
Oh, okay.
My name is Carlos Medina. I'm from New York City, so I went to high school at a New York City public school. I am currently a graduate student in the medical school as well, studying immunology and working on my PhD. And I went to Tufts University, which is just sort of outside of Boston. But Boston is tiny, so it's not that far out.
My name is Maggie. I am also a graduate student studying microbiology. And I am from rural Virginia, so also a high school none of you would have heard of. And I went to the University of Pennsylvania.
And I am Sean. I'm also a PhD student in biology right now. And I'm from Michigan, so I went to the public high school in my town. And then my undergraduate institution was Carleton College.
Okay. And let's go ahead and just kind of move right into the meat of things. So what are the top 3 factors that define where you went to your chosen undergraduate institution? And maybe we can start with Carlos in the middle this time.
Sure. So the 3 factors, I wrote these down, don't worry. So the first one for me was actually sort of proximity and distance from home, because most of my family lived in New York City, and very few lived outside of New York City. I knew that I didn't want to stay in New York City, actually, because I wanted to get away from my family a little bit, but the decision to stay within a couple of hours by a bus was pretty important to me, just because it was a pretty cheap and easy way to get home pretty often, which I did a lot in undergrad. The second thing I would say was the school's focus on an undergraduate education. So Tufts has a bunch of campuses that are spread out throughout Boston, and they have a med campus and a dental campus, and they have an undergrad campus. It's pretty much only undergrads, with one graduate school that has about 100 grad students. And so for me, I really liked that I would get this sort of undergraduate campus feel of being surrounded by a bunch of my peers. And the third thing was, for me, a focus on, for Tufts, civic engagement and a focus on diversity and discussions of diversity. Coming from New York City and being Puerto Rican, I felt like I wanted to go to a school where I could talk about my background pretty openly to people. And it seemed like their focus on civic engagement made everyone pretty aware of different socioeconomic classes and diversity and all those things. So I felt like I could talk and relate to people there. So distance from home, focus on sort of diversity, and focus on undergraduate education.
Maddie, you want to go?
Yeah, so I chose Penn, also reason number 1, distance from home, except I wanted to get a little further away, so Penn was more of a flight home and like an 8-hour drive, so it's doable, but I wanted to get north or west or somewhere further away from home, so that was the first thing. The second thing was, as I said, I was from a really rural area and I wanted to get into a city, so I liked the fact that Penn was smack dab in the middle of Philadelphia. It still had a campus, which was nice, but it was in a city. I really liked that. And the third reason I chose Penn is actually because I thought I was going to go into political science, and I really liked their political science department. It worked out great for me because Penn has a lot of different fields they're strong in, and I ended up going into biomedical sciences. So I kind of lucked out there, but yeah, keep in mind, you might not end up in the major you think you will.
So I chose Carleton, and if you're not familiar with Carleton, since it's a pretty small school, it's a liberal arts college in Minnesota that's about 2,000 students. And so my number 1 factor that I was looking for was a small liberal arts college. I definitely didn't know what I wanted to study, so it was very important to me to be able to not choose a major in my first couple of years at Tarleton you declare at the end of your second year. So I studied a lot of different stuff and then finally picked biology and chemistry, which is what I ended up majoring in. And then in addition to the liberal arts aspect, I went to a small college that had a high, faculty to student ratio, so that I wasn't going to be in these humongous classes, which I really liked. I was able to actually know a lot of my professors and know pretty much all my classmates. And then the third thing that I was looking for was kind of location. So I'm from the Midwest. I moved from Michigan to Minnesota for college, but I stayed in the Midwest, and I definitely liked that. Most of the schools I applied to stayed in the Midwest, although I applied at a couple on each coast.
So yeah, I picked UC Berkeley, first of all, also to get away from home. So I wanted to get pretty far away, and plus the fact that I have an uncle living in the Bay Area, which was really nice, especially for moving far away from home. The second reason why I picked Berkeley was because they had a really good, it's a really good research school, and I knew I wanted to try out research there. So I know there's a ton of lab at Berkeley, so yeah, that's one of the reasons why I decided I wanted to pick there. And the third reason being that it has a lot of volunteer opportunities because let's see. So there's a lot of student-oriented groups. So I volunteered with the Student Learning Center to help tutor people there, as well as volunteered with students at Oakland, and I thought that was very rewarding and enlightening. So yeah.
And I think the top 3 reasons I chose my college were very similar to what everybody else has said, but I also was factoring in cost because I put myself through college, so it needed to be affordable for me. So I wanted to get kind of far away from my family, but if I stayed in Massachusetts, it was a lot cheaper because I got an in-state tuition discount. But the school that I chose also, there's a lot of really excellent state schools in Massachusetts, but they also specialize in different things. So I thought that I wanted to be a psychologist back then, and they had a really good psychology program at Bridgewater. And so it was small classes, because it's kind of a liberal arts feel where there's not a huge student population, so you don't have these huge lecture halls of students. You know everybody in your class. There's about 50 people. So you know the faculty. You interact with them pretty regularly. So I wanted more tangible feel for being able to talk to the faculty and knowing my other students, my other peers in my classroom, and that kind of thing. I think those were the biggest factors in deciding to go to Bridgewater. But it came down to they all were pretty good state schools, and Bridgewater was the cheapest. So I loved it.
And if you want to introduce yourself, basically name, what you're doing, what program you're in now, and then also what undergraduate institution you went to, and then, yeah, to start that question.
Hi, I'm Vivian. I'm sorry I'm late. These buildings aren't ordered in a sensible manner. But I went to UCLA. I graduated in 2013, and I'm currently a Stanford graduate student in the biology PhD program.
And then we're curious about the top 3 factors that really define why you went to your particular institution, and then maybe why those were important to you.
So there are 3 reasons why I went to UCLA. It was distance, it was from family, it was cost, and it was a quality of school. So I'll explain those 3. Distance, I grew up in LA, born and raised, and my family is still there. And I wanted to be close enough so I could interact with them and be with my family, but still live on campus and still do what I wanted to do. So UCLA was a great place where it's the traffic was 2 hours, so I took it as 2 hours away from home, which was far enough, but close enough so that if I wanted to do laundry, I could do laundry and go home and eat home-cooked food. So it was very nice. 2, cost. I applied for so many different scholarships. I also had to pay for college, so I went to the cheapest college I could get into. And UCLA offered me tuition free, and I was just you can't really say no to that. So don't undersell yourself. Be willing to apply for scholarships, and that gives you some negotiating power about what school you want to go to. So I took it because I was the last of 3 kids. My parents are there's no money for you. sorry. You're smart enough to figure it out. And I was like, okay, here we go. So that's what happened. 3, I chose by the quality of school, but I wish I chose the school based on how well the fit was for me. UCLA is great. I loved UCLA. But I wish I had thought about if it was the right fit for me. Just because it's a generally good school doesn't necessarily it's perfect for you or it's going to meet all your needs. So I fell through some cracks, and I got really lucky because UCLA had some special programs for students who are interested in research, and I got sucked into that, which made the school a little bit smaller for me, and I had mentors. So I wish in high school I wish I asked people, why was I successful? What do you think I need in order to thrive? Because people are observing you, your teachers are observing you. So I wish I had asked that and known maybe a smaller school would have been a better fit for me. But luckily UCLA worked out, and now I'm here.
Excellent. Well, let's go ahead. The next question that I have for you is what kind of advice that you might have for a student, kind of following what Vivian had just done here. If there are some certain things that maybe you want to keep in mind as a high school student, so maybe suggestions that you might have. And let's go ahead and start with Sean this time.
Okay, so I think that you've heard our top factors, and when you're making your decision, you need to decide what your top factors are going to be. Because there's a huge milieu of like important things that yes are important, but maybe they're not the most important thing to you.
And I'm so glad because we just went through that
Yeah?
right before we
Okay,
got
that's
into
awesome.
panels. This is perfect. You guys ready? Okay.
Yeah, so go home and think about all that stuff and like consider what's really going to matter to you. And once you have that decision hierarchy, then I think what you need to do is like find schools that match and kind of score them basically, and then get your tops up so many schools, and go ahead and do the application process, which is no easy feat, I know. And then I think once you narrow down to the schools that you get into, I think visiting the campus is super helpful. For me, I had like my top 3 schools that I got into, and then I was able to visit each one of them, which was really nice. They offered to do this like campus visitation thing for all the accepted students. So if that's available to you, it's super helpful, and then you can really get a good feel for the campus, feel for the students, sit in on a class or 2. I was able to do like overnight stay in the dorm with students, which was super nice. So if you're able to do that, I would really take advantage of it.
Can I keep going this way? Okay. Yeah, I would say, okay, so I would echo 2 things. One, I also at Penn, I wouldn't go anywhere else. I loved my undergraduate experience, but I also fell through some cracks. And if I'd gone to a Carleton or a Bridgewater or one of those smaller schools, it would have been a very different thing. And it's because of my motivation level when I got into college. And there's nothing wrong with that, because some people at 18 are like, I'm ready, I know exactly what I want to do, I'm motivated, I could go to a school with 60,000 kids, be in a 600 class lecture hall and still want to be at the top, care about being at the top. And I was like, I really don't care that much. So if I'd been in those smaller classrooms where teachers had been like, you need to come to class, you need to work hard, you need to live up to your potential, it would have been really awesome. So yeah, you can get a good education anywhere, you can get a bad education anywhere. So really think about what would be a good fit for you personally at that time. And yeah, I think that's what I wish I had done. Thought more about the fit in particular.
I'd say in terms of the stage of sort of applying to and accepting schools, my biggest piece of advice would definitely be something along the lines of visit in some form if you can. And if you can't, ask to talk to current students via email or something, because I applied to some local schools and state schools. I applied to a bunch of, I think it's called colleges that change lives or something, like mostly these small liberal arts schools. That there was this book that came out, our graduate or college counselor essentially was like, you know, these schools are small, they're great liberal arts schools that are amazing, and I applied to a bunch of them and applied to Tufts and 1 or 2 other like bigger institutions. And I ended up visiting, you know, one from each of these categories and realized that I hated the small liberal arts college feel. My high school was very small, it's like 500 students total for all 4 years of high school, and it just felt sort of like the exact same thing, just like twice the size. And it totally bothered me that for like 4 years I had to deal with everyone knowing me and everyone knowing everything about me, like for another 4 years. And then I visited Tufts and like didn't really think I'd want a big school, which I thought 5,000 was big, but I loved it, and I loved the feel of like being able to meet new people without being overwhelmed. And I didn't know that until I visited. And Tufts had a visitation program, essentially. They offered visits and shuttles from New York, and sometimes they'll have this for students who are accepted after they're accepted. So I would just say, try to meet people in their environment. And it was talking to the undergraduate students like just there, with not like my parents around or not leading a tour or anything like that, where they gave me sort of just honest feedback about, you know, how stressed they were about classes and whether they felt like they enjoyed the social environment or how hard it was to get into Boston. Because everyone on tours will always say it's like, oh, a hop, skip, and a jump, but sometimes a hop, skip, and a jump is a lot when you're dealing with classes and things like that. So getting really honest feedback from people directly, that was helpful.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I don't have too much to add, except that to remember when you apply, because you should apply to a range of different kinds of schools. Easy, things that are well within your reach, things that are a little bit outside of it. And regardless of where you end up, your college experience is what you make out of it. So it doesn't matter where you end up going, even if it's not your first choice or the place you really wanted to get into, for whatever factor that is, it's about what you do while you're there. So are you taking advantage of the classes, of the extracurricular activities, of the research opportunities, and so forth? Because when you are applying for graduate school or the next step of your career beyond college, that's what the admissions committee is going to look at. They're not going to be like, oh, you went to some state school or liberal arts school that no one's heard of. They're going to say like, oh, they did research, they have a publication, they were involved in outreach groups, they were demonstrated leadership qualities. So it's really what you make of it, and just remember that as you go through the process.
Yeah, same thing with what they all said. One thing I want to add is if you do end up picking a big school, what I would have done was that I would have searched to fit in a community sooner. So either search in groups that you're interested in or looking at study groups, for example. There's a lot of different study groups on campus that, especially if you're in a really large school where you have 500 people in your class, it's very, very important for you to be able to go to these student groups and then either join a study session or just have people that you could relate to. So yeah, for really large schools, community and student groups are kind of like the key things I would have joined early.
And Vivian, do you have anything to follow up with?
I agree with a lot of what everyone has said. I felt the same way with Andrew, building a community of people who are going to keep you accountable and keep you like sane when you want to do something fun and when you need someone to be your study buddy. I definitely want to echo Stephanie where it's like, you see, we're not all from MIT, Harvard, or an Ivy League. We all went to different types of schools. We all did different things, and we're all ended up at Stanford. So the name isn't everything. I think some people hold a lot of like value in that, but I think if whatever you make that experience, that's what's valuable, and the name is just a name. So and like we said, all different colleges, all different types, all very happy with our experiences. So you get what you put into it.
And the next question that I have was what resources did you take advantage of from your institution that really helped you lead to the current position that you're in? So the kind of resources that you took advantage of that might have been available to you. And maybe we can start with Stephanie?
Sure. So I think the biggest resource that made a difference for me was just accessibility to faculty. The faculty, we didn't have TAs. The faculty taught every class. So if you had a question after class, you went and talked to the professor. You didn't talk to some intermediary person. And you got to know them, and through that, I got involved in a lot of undergraduate research because Bridgewater has a really great undergraduate research program. And it turned out, like I didn't know this at the time, I found out since that it was probably the best thing that I ever did, was get involved with undergraduate research on some level while I was at Bridgewater. And it was just because, like, we were friendly with all the faculty, like all the students knew them. We talked to them, say like, oh, you're really smart. I think you should go talk to so-and-so because this fits your interest and you should work with them. They can teach you more about what you want to know. And through that, you build this community, like these guys were saying, of a network of your peers who are interested in the same thing, who have similar motivations, so you keep each other on task. You kind of help each other cope with the stresses of college. And they're some of my best friends still to this day. They're people that we now help each other get through graduate school stuff. And so that, I think, is the most important thing that I did.
Okay, so I think I said this before, but the most important thing for me, the resource that I took was probably the Student Learning Center. So at first I went and got tutored there, and then I decided to tutor back for the newer people. And it was really helpful because it was, when you get tutored, it's very helpful for someone who had went through the classes that you're taking currently and could give you advice on like how to take the exam and whatnot. So, and it's a low stress situation, whereas talking to, let's say, the TAs or the professors would seem like really daunting, whereas when you're talking to a tutor, it's much more of a peer-to-peer kind of thing. And the second thing is once I decided to start tutoring, it was very helpful because when you tutor, or if you're helping all the other people on your courses, you're actually learning a lot more than if you're just kind of taking a class and listening on like lectures, which is, I guess, another study point, I guess. It's a lot better to study interactively rather than just sitting in a lecture. And it makes you more proactive as well because I think since I'm guessing most of you will end up in college, all of you are probably going to end up in college, one of the hardest things for me transitioning from high school to college was the fact that nobody is controlling your schedule anymore, so that you're kind of left to decide whether you want to do your homework or just skip all your lectures and then catch up at the very end right before midterm. So it's getting to the point. It's really good to have study buddies and people who you're in a group with in your classes. Whether that's through just making your own group people or going through the Student Learning Center or whatever other programs that is available.
So I can go back from here to one class at UCLA that I took. UCLA is a research university, and so I just took one class that was not a requirement, and I got sucked into research. So don't be afraid to take classes that interest you, that aren't part of the prerequisite for your major, because if I didn't take that one class, I probably wouldn't be here. So feel free to take classes that interest you.
So I'll say that every school has its own strengths and weaknesses, and so when you make your college decision, try and be aware of that. So for Carleton, one of the biggest strengths is definitely the accessibility of all the people. You're very close with these students. You just, like Bridgewater, it's very, the professors are accessible. There aren't any graduate student TAs, so when you have a question, you can just go right to the professor. And there are a lot of available kind of study groups that people join up with because you naturally just know people in your classes. If you're in the major, you kind of see the same people in every class. So that's probably the biggest advantage, and it really helped me definitely just like learn enough to become a graduate student, how to do science. But the weakness of Carleton and a lot of these small schools is that they're not research institutions. And so for me, I was aware of that, and during my summers, I would go and do research at a large institution, which is definitely like the key for having the research experience that allowed me to get into graduate school. So I'm just going to say that if you're applying to like a small school and you want to do research, you definitely have to supplement that with something else. So just be aware of the limitations and the strengths of your institution.
Yeah, so I think the thing I took advantage of that I was really happy about was also the research community at Penn, and that's because I ended up going into the sciences. But the reason I knew to do that is just going to professors when I took classes that I thought were interesting and being like, what's the next step in this field if I want to think about going into this field, if I want to think about what work would be like, what further school would be like, all that stuff, and that's any field that you go into. So talk to the professors about just what would you suggest I do in for like work or spare time or volunteering that would give me an idea about this field or something like that. So
I'd say the resource that I took the most advantage of was all of them. I was part of this Health Career Fellows like advising student group. I went to plenty of academic tutoring for my biology and chemistry courses because it just was not sticking. I applied for summer research programs as ways to sort of connect to faculty. I went to sort of mental health services when I was just having relationship issues and needed someone to talk to about that. I would say I used a lot of those resources, but I think overall each one of them helped me get through a tough time, or whether academically or personally. And at a lot of these institutions, they put a lot of time and effort into making a lot of resources for you guys to use, and there is no cap on how many you can use. So I agree that there are definitely things that help, but don't be afraid to use more than one, and don't feel like you're using too many resources, because that's impossible.
So at this point, I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions from the students in the audience. So if you guys could go back to maybe something that you had written down and you have a particular question for one of our panelists, or all of them for that matter, this would be your opportunity to do so. Yes?
What did you do in high school that you think made you stand out in the admissions?
So does anybody want to volunteer for that particular question? Because it's a more general question, yes?
What was the question?
The question was what what the panelists had done during their high school education that they felt made them a good candidate for college applications.
It's a long time ago.
Maggie, do you want to have a try at this one?
Yeah, okay, so honestly, I think what made it so that they didn't immediately toss on my application, because I was very average in many ways and a lot like their applicant pool. The one thing I think might have been unique was that I was from a rural area, which is not really something you can do anything about. They didn't get a lot of applications from like my area. So something that you could actually do something about though, I think a lot of people have, a lot of people have a lot of extracurriculars. If you have one particular extracurricular that you can show you were really passionate about and like really pursued strongly. So I wasn't just, a singer. I like went into singing training, and then I went to intern at the New York Opera in the summers, or I volunteered at my local opera, or whatever, if you could show. I think that's the only other thing I had going for me was like really deep into some of my extracurriculars to the point of it's looked ridiculous on a high schooler, I think.
Does anybody else have any comments to add?
I think I can add that having a really I think what I could add is that you should have a very strong letter of recommendation. So I had one teacher who I was in this new class called medical genetics, and then I thought that class was really, really cool, and it was a brand new class. So like every I think after every class I like went up to the teacher and then like asked a bunch of questions and showed that I was like very interested in it because I thought it was really cool. And then I think that resulted in a very strong letter of recommendation. So if you have someone who you look up to as a teacher, you should definitely try to build a relationship with that teacher, and then so that they will be able to write a really personal and a really strong letter of recommendation saying like this person has a passion about this subject and is really interested in doing a lot in this subject in the future, so that that would definitely make you stand out in terms of like if everything else was the same.
How about, is there any other questions that students have? Yes.
Were any of you guys part of like a Greek society?
And I'm just going to repeat the question. So the question was any of the students participating in Greek society? Raise of hands for the panelists. Anybody?
Do you felt like you missed out on that, or?
And not all schools have Greek
Yeah.
society.
Yeah.
So like Carleton is a small liberal arts college that doesn't have a Greek society. So not an option.
Yeah, and I went to a small liberal arts college where there was Greek societies, but none of them were national. They were only local Greek societies, which meant there was no connection to any other networks anywhere else. And I was not participating in Greek society.
And I have another question. Would you prefer? Would you say were you guys? Did you guys live in a dorm or like in an apartment during your college years? And what do you prefer?
And I'm going to repeat that question again. So the question was if any of the panelists had lived on campus or off campus, and if they preferred one location versus the other.
I can take that one. Well, I lived in the dorms even though I lived 20 minutes away. And that,
2 hours.
what?
2 hours.
2 hours with traffic. But that was a very intentional decision because some schools have great dorms. They're beautiful. The food is great. You want to live there forever. And they guarantee you housing. UCLA was one of those places. The food was delicious. The housing was tight, but everyone was there, was a community. The housing was a really big part of UCLA. And that's how they tried to make their communities smaller. But some schools are commuter schools where like 80% of their students commute. So you might want a dorm there because there aren't any dorms or the dorms aren't nice. So dorming was very intentional because UCLA has the second best food in the nation. So I tried to stay there as long as possible. And it was cheaper than anything else outside. Yeah. I also shared 3 to 1 room, so that made it really cheap though. And my best friends are the people I lived with. Yeah.
Or your worst enemies, depending on.
I'm standing in a wedding. I'm a bridesmaid at a wedding, so it wasn't that bad.
Sean, do you want to repeat?
Well, Carleton is pretty much a residential school. It's about an hour south of the Twin Cities in Minnesota, so it's kind of in farm country, and the town that it's in is pretty small. Definitely much smaller than all the cities around here. So anyway, pretty much everybody does live on campus. Carleton allows a certain number of students who are seniors to live off campus in apartments, but it's a pretty small number. So yeah, I lived on campus the entire time. I worked my way up from the crappy standard freshman dorm up into like a townhouse by the time I was a senior, which was pretty nice. But yeah, living on campus and being able to interact with all the other students, making really good friends with your roommates is definitely part of the college experience.
I started off in dorms and then eventually moved off campus, and I strongly recommend starting off in the dorms because again, it's easy to make friends. My best friend from college is still my best friend today, and I met her on my freshman hall. So it's just like ready-made little friend-making communities all set up for you. So I think dorms are great to start off in. And my dorm was not UCLA. It could like charitably be described as a dungeon, and the food was terrible. But I still loved it. I'm like so glad I lived in the dorms. And then I ended up moving off campus just so that I could spend more time taking advantage of Philly once I was a senior and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I was happy with that path.
Yeah, I also lived in a dorm and off campus. My freshman year, I lived in an all-freshman dorm, which was amazing. Just because everyone there is just new and trying to meet new people and make new friends. And also lived in a dorm second year with some of my friends in sort of a suite style living. And then third and fourth year, most students at Tufts end up living in sort of these 2 family homes that get rented out to students that are pretty much right around campus, just in the immediately surrounding area. And so we lived there, and so you sort of, with your group of friends, would rent an apartment and live there. And I would definitely say like living in dorms especially the first year, definitely I think helped to make it really easy to just meet new people because everyone's sort of in the same boat. And a lot of my friends who didn't live in all freshman dorms didn't meet as many people, but they still definitely met people, a lot of them upper years, who they became friends with. So I would sort of advocate for living in dorms, at least for your first year.
So I never lived in a dorm for a couple reasons. The first being that I'm a neat freak, and living with a bunch of other people like scared me to death. So I had 2 roommates, but they were also very neat. So it was like a house, and Massachusetts is full of all these like adorable older homes. So we like lived on the top floor of this old house that was closer to campus than the freshman dorm. So it worked out really well for me for that reason, but it also was a lot cheaper than living on campus. And for me, that was a huge factor. And like, I couldn't move home during the breaks and the summer and whatever. Like, I had a job that I had to go to, so I needed to be able to be in the same area all the time. So it was just logistically more practical for me to live off campus. And like the freshmen aren't allowed to have cars at Bridgewater, so if I had I couldn't get to my job without a car. So like, it was a lot of logistical things. But it was kind of easier to do at Bridgewater than sounds like maybe for some of these other guys, because Bridgewater is like a 60-40 commuter campus, like 60% of their student population commutes, and they just expect that as pretty normal. So they have a lot of activities that are geared more towards commuters, so you don't have to be living on campus to really connect with a lot of the other freshmen on campus. They have a lot of activities that are directed at making sure that you feel part of the community and you make friends, and you meet your other fellow freshmen when you come into school, but they realize that that's a problem for them.
Yeah, for me, I lived on campus on the first year and then moved off campus for the remainder of 3 years. Mostly because it was a lot cheaper off campus, and plus off campus was essentially the same distance as away from the dorm, so it didn't really make a difference. But I have to say that yes, I agree with everyone else. Being on campus in the housing definitely you definitely make a lot more friends in your first year that way.
Are there any other questions? Yes, in the back.
What are some pros and cons for picking a liberal arts or small colleges?
The question was, what are the pros and cons for selecting a small college? And I think I'll direct these to two smaller colleges that we went to, so Sean and Carlos, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
I guess actually there's several, so.
Yeah. So definitely one of the strengths of a liberal arts college is, one, the liberal arts aspect. You don't have to dive too deep too early. You get to explore a lot of things before you decide on your major. Two is because you have the small size, so you're able to know the faculty pretty well. You don't have, at least in a Carleton situation, you don't have TAs, so you get direct access to the faculty. And then you also get to build stronger relationships with your classmates, and you really know the student body. But a limitation that I really found because I ended up going into biology is that you didn't really have research opportunities very much at Carleton. So for me, it was very important to go outside of Carleton when I was in the summertime at these larger research institutions.
Maybe Carlos, do you want to follow?
Sure. Yeah, so Tufts is about 5,000 people. It's not quite as tiny as some of the smaller liberal arts colleges, but it's definitely a very small research institution. So one pro is that it is a research institution, so there are summer research opportunities at Tufts aplenty during the summer, so you don't have to go to other institutions to find the research you want to do. One of the cons of going to a smaller institution, honestly, for me, I don't really think of Tufts as being like a small institution, just because I feel like even though it pales in comparison to some of these larger schools, it felt like it was big enough that it had everything that I needed for me, and small enough that I thought I knew everyone, although when you reach your senior year and you have these like senior activities and you're like, who's that person? So it's definitely big enough that you don't meet everyone or know everybody's sort of business, but I don't know, I can't think of a
And maybe I can address some of that. I went to a small liberal arts college with 2,000 students, and I really enjoyed the community feel. Like that's why I went to small liberal arts colleges, that I wanted to get to know my professors and to have good relationships with the students that I came in with, like to know everybody in my class essentially. But in terms of limitations, I also found I didn't have certain degree programs that I might have been interested in had those been available. So because it was a small liberal arts college, we had biology, we had chemistry, we had math. We didn't even have an engineering school or a computer science school. So those kinds of opportunities were not available to me when I was an undergraduate. So I couldn't really explore them and try them out, which I think I might have really enjoyed. So for me, that was the limitation. And at this point, we've actually ran out of time. If you have another question, maybe you can run up and talk to some of the people directly. So let's get together, maybe give a round of applause to our